Multiple people remember the same event. Not something similar, not something vague. The exact same moment. Same place, same sequence, same details. There's just one problem. It never happened. At least, not according to anything that can be verified. No records, no footage, no logs, no physical evidence of any kind. But that's not what made it strange. What made it strange was how consistent the memories were. It didn't start with a large group, just one person describing something that felt specific but unimportant at first. A small incident, something that could have easily been ignored. He described being in a building late at night, not alone, but not fully aware of who else was there. He remembered a brief interruption, lights shifting, a sound that didn't belong. Nothing dramatic, just out of place. The kind of thing you notice and then forget. Except he didn't forget. And when he described it, he didn't describe it like a memory. He described it like something that had just happened. That alone wouldn't have mattered. People misremember things all the time. Except someone else heard him describe it and stopped him halfway through. Not to correct him, but to finish the description, word for word. Same location, same sequence, same details. Neither of them had talked about it before. Neither had any reason to connect the two experiences. And yet, they remembered the same thing. That's when it should have been dismissed as coincidence. Except it didn't stop there. Because once you hear something like that, you start asking questions. And the more people we asked, the more consistent the story became. Different individuals, different times, different contexts. But the same event, not similar, identical. At that point, it stopped being a memory issue. Because memory doesn't synchronize across unrelated people. Not like that. Not with that level of precision. So, the question changed. Not, did it happen? But something much harder to answer. Why do so many people remember it if it never did? The first thing we tried to do was verify it. Not the memory, the event itself. If something had actually happened, even something small, there would be traces. Systems record everything. Cameras capture more than people notice. Logs track details no one pays attention to in real time. So we started with the obvious. Security footage. The location described wasn't unusual. A standard building, monitored, logged, nothing that would suggest a gap in coverage. We pulled the recordings for the exact time frame people kept referencing, and everything looked normal. No interruptions, no lighting changes, no unexplained movement. Just an empty corridor, still, quiet. Exactly what should have been there. We checked again. Different angles, different timestamps. Nothing. It wasn't missing. It was never there. That should have been the end of it. Except the people describing it weren't uncertain. They weren't guessing. They were consistent, down to details that shouldn't matter. The sound, the timing, the way the lights shifted for just a moment. Even the order in which things happened. That level of alignment doesn't come from imagination. It comes from experience. So we expanded the search. Access logs, entry records, device activity. Anything that could confirm someone was there at the time. And again, nothing. No entries, no exits, no unusual activity. According to every system we checked, that moment did not exist. And yet, people could describe it. Not vaguely. Not approximately. Precisely. That's when we started looking at the problem differently. Not as a missing event, but as something that existed only in memory. Because if multiple people remember something that never happened, then either all of them are wrong in exactly the same way, or something else is happening entirely. Something that doesn't rely on physical evidence. Something that doesn't need to leave a trace. At that point, we weren't trying to prove the event happened anymore. We were trying to understand how something that never happened could be remembered so clearly. At that point, we stopped trying to find the event and started focusing on the people who remembered it. Because if the event left no trace, but the memory did, then the memory itself was the only evidence we had. So we documented everything. Not just what they remembered, but how they remembered it, the way they described it, the order of details, the confidence in their voice. At first, everything seemed consistent. That was expected. But when we asked the same people again, things began to shift. Not dramatically, not enough for them to notice, but enough to matter. A small detail would change. The timing would feel slightly different. The sequence would adjust by just enough to be noticeable if you were comparing it side by side. And the person describing it wouldn't realize anything had changed. To them, it was still the same memory. That shouldn't happen. Not like that. Memory can degrade over time. It can become less accurate, but it doesn't rewrite itself while remaining equally convincing. And yet, that's exactly what was happening. The more times someone recalled the event, the less stable it became. Not weaker, not fading, just different, and still believable. That's when we tested something more controlled. We took two people who both remembered the same version of the event. We had them write it down, separately. At the same time, the results should have matched. They didn't. Not anymore. The structure was still there. The core moment still existed, but the details had shifted. Subtly, just enough to no longer align perfectly. And neither of them saw the difference. Each believed their version was unchanged. That's when the pattern became clear. The memory wasn't fixed. It wasn't being recalled. It was being reconstructed every time. And whatever was causing it was influencing that reconstruction. Not randomly, consistently, which meant this wasn't just a shared memory. It was a shared process. And once that idea settles in, the situation becomes much harder to ignore. Because if something can alter how memory is reconstructed, then it doesn't need to change reality. It just needs to change how reality is remembered. Once we realized the memory was changing, we stopped asking people to recall it and started tracking when it changed. We documented every interaction, every time someone thought about it, every time it was mentioned, every time it was written down, and a pattern started to form, not based on time, not based on location, but based on exposure. The more someone engaged with the memory, the more it shifted. Not immediately, not predictably, but inevitably. That suggested something we hadn't considered before. The act of remembering was part of the process. Not passive, not neutral, active. As if recalling the event wasn't accessing a stored memory, but triggering something that rebuilt it. And if that was true, then the original version might not exist anymore, only the current one, whatever it had become. So we expanded the scope. We looked beyond the original group, forums, archived discussions, old posts, anything that might reference a similar experience. And we found them, scattered, unrelated, people describing moments that didn't exist, but were remembered with the same level of clarity. Not identical events, but identical structure. A brief disruption, a detail out of place, a moment that should have been insignificant, but stayed. And when we compared those descriptions, the pattern held. not in content, in behavior. Each memory changed the same way, gradually, subtly, without the person noticing. That's when it stopped being a local anomaly, because whatever was happening wasn't limited to one place or one group. It was appearing in different contexts, different environments, different people, with no connection between them, except one. They all remembered something that never happened, and the more they tried to understand it, the less stable it became. That's when the question changed again. Not what the event was, not whether it happened, but whether the memory was ever supposed to stay the same. At that point, we stopped trying to compare the memories and started asking a different question. Not what people remembered, but why they remembered anything at all. Because if the event never happened, then there was nothing to remember, which means the memory wasn't a record of something real. It was something else, something constructed. That idea didn't feel right at first, because memory doesn't just appear. It's built from experience, from perception, from something that actually exists. But this didn't, and yet it felt just as real. That's when we looked at something we had ignored until then. The first person who described the event, not what he said, but when he said it. Because according to everything we had, he was the first one, the origin point, the earliest record of that memory. So we went back and checked everything around that moment, not the event, the timeline, when he first described it, when he first wrote it down, when anyone else heard it, and something didn't line up, because the second person, who finished his description word for word, had documented the same memory earlier, before the first person ever mentioned it, at least according to the timestamps. That shouldn't be possible, unless one of the records was wrong, or both of them were. But the more we checked, the worse it got, because a third record appeared. Another person, same memory, logged even earlier. At that point, the idea of a first person stopped making sense, because the memory didn't seem to originate from anyone. It didn't start somewhere. It just existed, across different people, at different times, with no clear beginning. And that changes the entire problem. Because if a memory has no origin, then it wasn't created by someone. It was introduced. And once something like that exists, you can't treat it as a mistake anymore. You have to consider a different possibility, that the memory isn't about an event. It is the event. After that, we stopped collecting new accounts, not because we had enough data, but because it stopped behaving like something we could measure. The more we tracked it, the less consistent the timeline became, not just the details, the order of events. Who heard it first? Who remembered it first? Those things started to shift, depending on when you checked. And that's when we realized something we should have seen earlier. We were treating the memory like a record, something fixed, something that happened once and was recalled later. But it wasn't. It was active. It didn't stay in the past. It updated, not in a visible way, not in a way any system could track, but in a way that affected how it was remembered. And, more importantly, when it was remembered. That's why the timeline didn't hold, because there was no before or after, only the current version, whatever it had become at that moment. So we tried one final test. We documented the memory ourselves, wrote it down, stored it, locked it. No changes, no access, no exposure. If the pattern held, it shouldn't change. And for a while, it didn't. The record stayed exactly as we wrote it, unmodified, stable, until we opened it again, just once. to confirm, and when we read it, it was still familiar, still structured the same way. But one detail had changed. Not removed, not added, replaced, subtly, in a way that didn't feel wrong, just different. And none of us could agree on what had changed, because each of us read a slightly different version. At that point, there was nothing left to verify, no system to check, no log to compare, because whatever this was didn't rely on physical records. It didn't need to exist in reality, only in perception. And once something exists there, it doesn't need to be true. It only needs to be remembered. The last time we tried to trace it, we searched for the earliest version, the first record, the origin, and we found something. A single entry, stored in an archive that hadn't been accessed in years. No author, no context, just a description. The same event, written exactly the way people still describe it now. And the timestamp didn't make sense, because it was dated before the building it supposedly happened in was ever constructed.